Thanks for tuning in. Our guest this week is former Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Cherry with his take on the state of politics in our state today. Our lead story, lawmakers are on spring break. What have they left behind since the first of the year? Around the OTR table, Rick Pluta, Emily Lawler, and Bill Ballinger. Sit in with us as we get the inside out, off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Thank you very much. Welcome back to Off the Record. On a Thursday morning, we are taping this week in Studio C. Let's talk about paying to have a child carried by somebody else. What's going on there, Emily?
Yeah, so the Michigan legislature, the Senate this week passed some bills related to that, sort of opening up women's options and families' options and kind of carving out this route for surrogacy in Michigan that has been available in other parts of the country for a long time.
We were an outlier, Rick, on this thing. It was banned.
Yeah, well, Michigan...
It still is banned.
Yeah, and Michigan was one of the first states in the country in the late 1980s to outlaw the practice because there was a doctor in Dearborn who sort of led the way in creating these contracts. And now we are among the last of the states that it appears to be on a path to allow it and to regulate it.
But why was it banned at that time? I mean, what is the motive?
It was considered unnatural, and it was considered by a lot of interests, including the Catholic Church, to be an opportunity to exploit poor women in particular who might, offer themselves as surrogates for money. We should say that it's never been illegal. Surrogacy itself has never been illegal in Michigan. Only paying surrogates
so it's
to
a commercial
carry
aspect.
It was the commercial aspect.
And nothing
exactly.
has changed because the Catholic Church was quick to grind out a press release after the Senate took the action and said thanks, but no thanks.
Well, it looks like they're probably going to lose because I think probably the trend is to get in sync with the other states. And I think it's probably going to be expunged. The idea of paid contracts is now going to be illegal.
The votes are there.
Yeah.
So, and it's going to go to the governor, who has said she is looking forward to signing it.
All right, does this fit into the Democratic plan that we need another Proposal 3 that we can take to the voters in this election year, the female right to decide their own body decisions?
I think that's absolutely a theme of the election. I don't think it's going to be a physical proposal on our ballot this year.
Right.
Certainly Governor Whitmer benefited from that in the 2022 cycle, as did Democrats up and down the ticket. I do think that, they didn't call it the right to get an abortion amendment. They called it the reproductive freedom amendment. And I really do think that as a theme, that's something that Democrats are leaning into up and down the ticket again this cycle.
Well, if Right to Life of Michigan or the Michigan Catholic Conference think this is a terrible idea to allow paid surrogacy, they can mount a petition drive to call for a referendum, which is a much easier number of signatures to get than a constitutional amendment. They could put it on the ballot. But I can't believe they're going to do that.
Well, I doubt it's a political winner. I haven't seen anything to indicate that it's a political winner. And I
mean, if they do that, if they do a petition drive.
Right, if they do a petition drive and put a referendum on the ballot. But, as Emily pointed out, that this has been a theme in Lansing under the trifecta, the Democratic trifecta in the legislature and the governor's office, to create basically talking points regarding reproductive rights. Even if it's not explicitly on the ballot, there is still a record to bring to voters to talk about.
And we should say some Republicans did join Democrats in voting for this. It's not a strict partisan line issue. But, I think if you're a Democratic candidate this cycle, you want to keep reproductive health on the front lines. I think if you're a Republican, maybe you don't. I think there's some sense that maybe you'd rather talk about the economy or something else.
And also from a policy standpoint, that Michigan was on the front lines of banning it, but most states allow it, and it doesn't seem to have created sort of the sky is falling scenarios that were brought out in the 1980s early in this.
All right, the EPA, the EPA down in Washington this week moved out by 2 years the deadline for getting the fleet of EV vehicles. What's the significance of this here in our state?
Yeah, so really it's to reduce tailpipe emissions. This has been a longstanding goal of the Biden administration, and it stands that by 2032, automakers will probably have about 2/3 of their fleets be EVs to comply with the rules. There was some adjustments yesterday to the timeline, a little bit of loosening. I think the automakers had some really big concerns about the initial proposed timeline. But, the bottom line is I think that, when you go to purchase a car, when you're looking at GM's lineup or Ford's lineup, you're definitely going to see a lot of EVs in the mix.
Were there any...
Full disclosure, happy EV owner here. But also...
How happy are you?
Quite.
When's the last time you were stuck up north and couldn't get juice?
Well,
Rick, answer the question.
No, you do. It does change how you plan your trips. And I don't know that, well, actually, I do know that if we didn't also have a gas-powered vehicle, that an EV would be a good choice for us. But what I was going to go to is, these targets were going to be difficult, if not impossible, from a commercial aspect to hit. And so when you're not going to make the target, it's probably a good idea to change the target.
Well, the target had become a political target. How much of this decision in Washington, and they won't admit this, but let me just throw it on, it was generated by what Mr. Trump has been saying about EVs.
Yeah.
Last time I checked, 2032 is after the November election.
I agree. Look, all I can say is I want to be able to keep my gas-guzzling fossil fuel car as long as possible. And so long as they don't
You're looking for an exemption?
Make me put some special equipment on my car to reduce my emissions, I'm okay with this. It's going to take a long time to phase this in.
Sure, and these are, and by the way, for people who don't know, Bill's car itself is a fossil. But these are targets for new vehicle sales. That this isn't, something about whether or not.
But does this take the heat off this issue for the Biden administration to have this breathing room now, politically?
It's a little bit of breathing room, but it's not like they backed off the standard. The result's going to be the same, and I think that that's an important part of the Biden administration's message. And, frankly, I think that we've seen not only Democrats, but some Republicans as well, sort of lean into the economic potential of an EV transition. And so I do think that, Mr. Trump's messaging has definitely hit on this, and I think a lot of people are feeling like they can't afford EVs regardless. But, I wouldn't expect that this particular decision is necessarily a response to that.
And the Trump messaging is to...
With the election coming up, yes, it helps the Biden administration to do this, back off a little bit.
And the Trump messaging has been to just, create this sense of upheaval, discontent, uncertainty among those union manufacturing swing voters.
You want to talk about the Auditor General. The governor proposed cutting the budget by 28%. Republicans came unglued. The Auditor General, as you might expect, wrote a letter and said, we might as well close the shop. Okay, we're done.
He didn't get a heads up at all.
The Auditor General does.
Yeah, well, the Auditor General is the arm of literally the legislature to oversee how the executive branch is carrying out the responsibilities given to it by the legislature.
And oftentimes, Auditor Generals have critical things to say about departments that governors are running.
Absolutely. And look, in many states, the Auditor General is elected statewide. And in Michigan, the Auditor General was one of the 8 statewide elected offices until the new Constitution, the one we have now. The delegates to the CONCON took it away, gave it to the legislature to appoint. The governor does not appoint the Auditor General. The legislature does.
So why is the governor hacking away at this thing?
Because, as you just said, the Auditor General, which is a nonpartisan office of a bunch of bean counters in green eye shades, they sit around, they analyze how the executive branch agencies are handling their business, and they say, you know what, you screwed up this, you screwed up that. They put out a report, and it's sent all over state government to the news media, and some of it has been very critical of the Whitmer administration.
Well, we should point out that most of the Auditor General reports that come out, and the language is very, like you said, it's accountant speak and it's technical, will find that there were no reportable conditions, or if they were insignificant. The departments or the agencies agree with them, and they go ahead to fix it. But those aren't the ones that capture the attention of the public.
The State Liquor Control Commission lost $1 million in booze.
Exactly.
Will the people that had that, will you please call the state because they want their liquor back? I mean, there's a perfect example of that doesn't look good, does it?
No, and that was one that got a lot of attention, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how that happened.
Look, it gets down to this. Governor proposes, the legislature disposes. So she's proposed cutting the budget by that amount. She, by the way,
says that line only applies to the budget, okay? Nothing else.
Okay. But the legislature's got to go along with that. And the question is, does the legislature, controlled by the same party as the governor, the Democrats, in both the House and Senate, do they just accede to what the governor wants? Or do they stand up to the governor and say, look, governor, this is our agency. Basically, we appoint the auditor general. They're a watchdog. Everybody loves them, feels they've got to be there. And you can't emasculate the Auditor General.
And if there's any question that the Auditor General acts as an independent entity within the legislative branch, the fact that both the House and the Senate are controlled by Democrats, the governor is a Democrat, and the Auditor General still put out this report that had some pretty damning things to put out there about how the Liquor Control Commission is handling its particular state responsibilities in managing the liquor distribution system in the state, shows that it is in fact an independent entity.
Well, when you say we can't account for it, which is what the Liquor Control Commission said, that's sort of, I guess we made a mistake, eh?
But these audits lead to improvements, like the agencies really do take this feedback and turn it into more efficient processes.
Yeah. All right, the governor was down in Washington, D.C. over the weekend giving a speech to the Gridiron Club. Emily, you read the speech. It was sort of funny.
She's sort of funny. I think she does great when she's on that sort of national stage bantering with an audience, and we saw that in the speech.
All right, here were the two quotes. At the beginning of the speech, she says to this audience of journalists, for those of you who don't know what the Gridiron Club is, quote, "I have zero national aspirations." Okay? And at the end of the speech, she ends the speech by saying, "I'll see you in 2029. I'll see you all again in 2029." And she winks at the camera. She had it both ways, Ricky.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I might.
Well, maybe, she's 2029 is after the election of 28. You'd think she'd say, "I'll see you in 2028." So maybe she's saying, "I'll see you in Washington as a member of somebody's cabinet."
Well, or she'll just get a ticket. But no, but it is classic Whitmer that she is a funny person. She is a funny person off the cuff. Although the speech to the Gridiron dinner obviously was not off the cuff, and it's the sort of thing that has made her kind of a darling of the national political establishment. Not to mention Saturday Night Live.
To put a ribbon on this is a story that is not going away. So buckle up.
It wasn't going away anyway.
We got to get out. Here's John Cherry. Nice to see you again, sir, and thanks for doing OTR.
Good to see all of you.
All right, let's start out with the obvious. Describe for me, in your mind, what is the state of our political game in our state and country as we sit here this Thursday morning?
In general, politics has become very divisive. I actually think in Michigan, we're seeing a lot more progress in governance than we do nationally. But nonetheless, we're a very divided society, and that's been reflected in our politics.
And what's the solution?
Well, I think there's some of this has a pendulum effect. We go through periods of times in which there's more social consensus about things, and then we have times of division, and we're in one of those. I think that's aggravated a little bit by the degree and role that consultants play in politics today, election consultants, because their advice, and I'm not saying it's inaccurate, but their advice is that you play to division. You talk about what angers people, and that anger tends to be reflected then in how they vote and how we govern.
Let's see what Emily has to ask.
So, one thing that was kind of a hallmark of the Granholm administration was incentives for electric vehicles. That's something that the state is leaning into heavily again. I'm wondering how you've seen that landscape change over the years, and if you think that we will be a hub for EV development here in the state.
Well, I think somebody's going to be a hub, because in the end, whether it's quick or whether it's or gradual, we're going to be moving to alternative fuel automobiles. Electric seems to be the place right now that we're headed. There's a lot of infrastructure investment that has to be made, but we're going to be moving in that direction. And the fact that the auto companies are developing EV fleets tell you that that's where we're headed. I think Michigan has to get into that game. I mean, if that's the kind of car we're going to drive, it's the kind of car Michigan's going to have to produce.
Well, what should the role of state government be in doing that? Throwing state financial incentives at car companies is obviously controversial, and we've been having this debate since the 1980s at least.
Oh, I think it goes back farther than that. I mean, we've always been competing. As a legislator back in the early 80s, under the Blanchard administration, we were engaged in economic competition. Incentives always played a role for that. Whether it's the auto industry or some other industry, incentives are going to play a role. There's been a debate over time over the film industry. I mean, it seems that we compete with other states for different types of technological businesses. And Michigan has an automotive history. We've got some advantages there. We ought to be taking care of our advantages, and that means that we ought to be putting some incentives behind that.
Governor, to change the subject, the office of Auditor General, at one time it was a statewide elected office, but under the current Constitution, the last 65 years, it's been appointed by the legislature. So it's really a creature of the legislature. When you were in the Senate, was it a very valuable tool to you? Because Governor Whitmer has now proposed cutting the budget of Auditor General dramatically, and a lot of people are yelling bloody murder that she's trying to emasculate the Auditor General. What do you think?
Well, Bill, I'm not real close to that debate, but it's caused me some confusion as I watched it. As you said, it was a legislative agency, and it was in the legislative budget, and the legislature was in charge of its budget. I suspected that this had been back in the 1970s or 1980s. The legislature would say, we're in charge of our budget, Governor. We'll put the money that we want for the Auditor General there. So I'm confused about this debate. Why the legislature, if they feel the Auditor General is doing the job that they want, that they should be funding it. It strikes me unusual that the governor is establishing a funding level for the Auditor General.
Well, also, now that you've got a Democratic trifecta, Democratic governor, Democratic-controlled House and Senate, if the governor says, I want to cut this budget, I can't see the legislature necessarily standing up to her and saying, sorry, Governor, we're going to hold on to the money that we think the Auditor General should have. What do you think?
Well, I served in a trifecta once, and I'm trying to think about what Dominic Jacobetti would say to the governor.
We should point out that
remember, this is a clean family program, Governor.
We should point out that back in the day, Dominic Jacobetti was the very colorful chair of the House Appropriations Committee from the Upper Peninsula, who had a colorful way of expressing himself.
Well, and you could go to Harry Gast with a Republican trifecta. He would have taken the same position. So it comes down to a question of how much the legislature values the Auditor General. If they don't stand up and fund the institution, then they themselves have questions about the effectiveness of the Auditor General.
So it sounds like you're recommending that the legislature ought to stand up and tell the governor, at least when it comes to this particular budget proposal, don't cut it?
Yes, if they feel the Auditor General is important to their functioning.
Well, it's already become.
It was when I was there. Now, how it's functioning now, I really don't know.
It's already become partisan. As you pointed, everything is very divisive and polarized in our society and in our politics right now. The Republicans have picked up the mantle in defense of the Auditor General. They said this is an outrage. You can't cut the Auditor General. It's a nonpartisan office, and this should not happen. So if the Democrats don't side with the Republicans and they just go along with the governor, they're probably going to win, the Democrats, and it will be cut, the budget, for the Auditor General, don't you think?
Well, if the Democratic majority does not feel the Auditor General is providing a useful function for them, yeah, it's gonna suffer in an appropriations debate and be hurt by it. But again, it all comes down to what services the Auditor General is providing to the legislature and whether the legislature values that service.
Governor, let's talk about the next governor's race, which is a long ways down the road, but already people are positioning, including somebody in your backyard. What do you know about the sheriff running for governor? And then let's talk about Mike Duggan.
Well, I've simply have not been engaged in that, what I like is that apparently Democrats have a very strong bench here. That there are a number of candidates who have good experience, that seem to be well respected, and that bodes well for the Democratic Party to have those choices available to it. So I think that's healthy. Well, I'm not committed to any candidate, and quite frankly, I've not seen where those candidates have started a discussion about that either. People really right now are focused on the presidential and the U.S. Senate election, and I think they're just saying, well, 2026 will come when 2026 comes.
Yeah, except they are not. They are doing stuff behind the scenes, as you well know. You don't start tomorrow if you want to run for governor. Now, talk to me about Mike Duggan. What kind of relationship did the Granholm administration have with him?
Well, there was both Mike and Governor Granholm came out of the Wayne County operation, and I knew they had a great deal of respect for each other. They worked very closely on a number of issues. Mike was at the time the head of the Detroit medical institutions there, and did a tremendous job putting that back together. So I think there's always been a lot of respect. I think because of that relationship, there's been a relationship between Mike Duggan and President Biden. So I think there's an element of closeness there, and a lot of respect.
Governor, let me ask you, Mike Duggan is from, obviously, Detroit, mayor of Detroit. There have been only 2 governors in Michigan history that have come from Detroit, Hazen Pingree and Frank Murphy. Very hard for somebody coming out of Detroit to be elected governor, historically. Do you think Mike Duggan has a good chance to break that lineage, or is he going to be up against the same problems other candidates from Detroit have had?
Well, first I would note, both in the case of Pingree and Murphy, that they were very highly respected governors. So those 2 candidates resulted in outstanding governors from Michigan. As I read this, there really are 3. I'm hearing 3 potential candidates coming out of Detroit: Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, Secretary of State Benson, and Mayor Duggan. So there's an excellent chance that somebody from Detroit will be the Democratic nominee for governor.
And with those 3 people running, Governor, there's also an excellent chance that you're going to have an ugly primary.
Well, that's always a debate about, does a primary help or does it hurt? And in many respects, if you have a primary and it doesn't become too negative, then then the candidate that emerges is a fairly strong candidate. You know, Governor Granholm emerged from a Democratic primary and was a strong candidate. So it didn't hurt the party to have that contest when she was nominated. So I don't see necessarily a primary being a detrimental thing.
On the other hand, if there are three candidates from Detroit and they split up the vote, somebody outstate, like Genesee County Sheriff Swanson or maybe Mark Hackel or somebody like that, could squeeze in on the rail.
That's a real possibility. I mean, that'll make for an interesting primary. That'll make your job very interesting, give you something to do for the next couple of years, and I'm sure you're looking forward to that.
Governor, I promised to get you out. You've got an appointment coming up. Can we assume that you don't want to be lieutenant governor again? Is that a fair assumption?
I don't think I can legally.
Well, you could get somebody. You could get your son to change the law.
Oh, well, you know.
I don't think so.
I might disown him if he did.
Governor, it's good to see you again. Thanks for doing the program, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
All righty. Also, thanks to our great panel. See you for more Off the Record right here next week.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Martin Waymeyer, a full-service strategic communications agency, partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and public policy engagement. Learn more at martinwaymeyer.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan Public Television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.